Yeah, don't go on the tangent.
No, yeah, this is the hard part, right?
I did it at home with Julie, and I was able to knock it off in 11 minutes, so I have some wiggle room.
Really?
Yes, I just turned it on to 45 instead of 33 and a half.
See, I can't speak too fast because
Yeah.
my voice goes lower. And then they have a hard time to understand, so I speak slow.
If you're just joining us, come get some food before we start.
So I'm not gonna use that. This I have to, but for the video. But I can speak loud enough. Not. I already asked these guys if it's.
I'll use it because
Yeah. Yeah.
wait for my glasses.
We ready to roll? All right, ready to roll? Okay. All right, well, thanks everybody for coming here. My name's Paul Heider. I teach history for social sciences. And back in the before times, we used to do, we'd pick a topic and then have someone from each of our disciplines in the department do 15 minutes. So we've got political science and history and economics in our department, so you're going to get 15 minutes of each. Brian Dilly is political science, Sylvia Cavalcante is economics, and I'm doing history, and history's always first, so I'm going first. You should all have a document that lists classes that we offer that pertain to what we're going to be talking about today. So let us get moving here. We'll start with a quote. This is John McCain, Senator John McCain in 2008 during the presidential debates. He said about Vladimir Putin, "I looked into his eyes and I saw 3 letters, a K. And I said before, watch Ukraine. Ukraine right now is in the sights of Vladimir Putin." This wasn't the first time that John McCain had taken a shot at Putin, and it wouldn't be the last. And he was right. So I'm going to start this story with the Berlin Wall in 1961. So I know it's a little bit washed out because of the light, but this is Germany after World War II, and it was split in half, basically. Actually, not quite half. This would be West Germany, this would be East Germany. And complicating things was the fact that Berlin was in East Germany, and it was also partitioned between East and West. And one of the problems was that if you were in Eastern Germany, you could go into Eastern Berlin. From Eastern Berlin, you could go to Western Berlin, and from Western Berlin, you could get out. And so in 1961, the Soviet Union built the Berlin Wall, and the Berlin Wall became a symbol of the Cold War. So fast forward to 1989, I'm sitting in my apartment in Minnesota, and the Berlin Wall comes down, and it was unbelievable. Now the story behind it's way too complex to share here, but one thing is certain, everybody was surprised. It just, out of nowhere, it came down. And with that came a lot of geopolitical changes. One of the guys who happened to be witnessing this was a guy named Vladimir Putin. He's a youngster here. He's a married KGB officer. He's got a wife, small child, kind of fuzzy here. This is his first daughter in that blanket. And he was living in Dresden, East Germany, living a pretty comfortable life. He was a KGB officer. And as the regime of his host nation fell, East Germany, in 1989, Putin watched as crowds began to storm the headquarters of the secret police. And along with the nearby KGB office where he had worked, he was looking for protection from this crowd. And so he called up a commander of a Red Army task unit. And the commander said he would not help without approval from Moscow. And the commander said, "Moscow is silent." So this was a big change for Vladimir Putin. He moved back to St. Petersburg, which is where he was from. And he actually considered becoming a taxi driver. And looking back on it, that probably would have been a really good career choice. Instead, though, he used his old KGB contacts, and he was able to thrive in the new Russia. And as he worked his way up the ranks in the process. So, this is kind of a quick and dirty overview of what happened next. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves. And a lot of the satellite countries that were part of the Soviet Union declare their independence. Ukraine is one of them. In the early 1990s, Russia is trying to transition into a democratic capitalist society. There's no real history for any of that there. And so the shock, it became known as shock therapy, was rough on the citizens of Russia. In fact, the standard of living for many Russians was worse during shock therapy than it was during the Soviet Union. All right? It would take a while for these reforms to take hold, but the process was brutal. And it got to the point where during the late 1992, there was a public opinion poll, and most Russian people had soured on democracy. They equated all the trouble they were having with democracy. So you say democracy, they think of what all this bad stuff is going on. I don't want any democracy. All right? They want while all that's all in the hands of very few, very rich. You've heard of the term oligarchs. These are those guys. 1993, a new Russian constitution is adopted. One of the very balances. So whoever is that is unchecked. While all this is going on, Putin is making his way up service, otherwise known as the FSB. This is a but in 1998, he is in charge of the FSB, which puts him in a pretty strong position. As president, he gets appointed president in 1999, and he ends up getting elected president. In a 2000 address, he's trying to reassure foreign investors that, hey, it's okay to come to Russia. It's safe here. Your money's safe here. He wants international investment. The rise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, Putin said. As for the Russian people, it became a genuine of our fellow citizens and countrymen found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory. Kind of a so it's helpful to kind of do a quick and dirty overview of Russian history. So this is going to be really fast. So this is Russia in 1553. This is Russia at the end of the 1890s. It's huge and powerful, and people who are part of this empire are pretty proud of it. All right? Now we move into the year right before World War II breaks out. All right, this is the Soviet Union. And they'd actually, in the 1930s, 1939, they actually had snipped off some of the Baltics here. Lithuania, Latvia, all these countries up here had been independent, but they no longer were. They were part of the Soviet Union. And this is before Germany invades the Soviet Union. So this is after World War II, and I know this is going to be pretty fuzzy, so just pay attention to this line right here, okay? So this is the Soviet Union, and these are Cold War countries that are behind the Iron Curtain. So you've got East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. So this is really, all this area is under control of the Soviet Union, all right? All right, this is after the Soviet Union falls apart. Notice the line. These republics have declared independence. Belarus is allied with Russia right now, but Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and obviously not Ukraine, they are not allied with Russia, okay? So you can see that the borders of the West have creeped up to Russia. And that's a scary historical situation for Putin, particularly when you consider what the Russian Empire used to look like, what the Soviet Union used to look like. So I've got the maps side by side so you get a better sense of what's going on. So here's the, all of this is under control of the Soviet Union. Here's the line, and you can see the creep. The West is getting very close to the line. So why Ukraine? So for the most part, Russia's economic activity is mostly in the east. You can see the darker it is where there's more population. So most of the population, economic activity, it's all in the east. In the west, or I'm sorry, flip that around. It's in the west. In the east, there's not much going on in comparison. Okay, so most of what's important to Russia is along its western border, and that's where it's concentrating its foreign policy. Some other reasons, there's a historical connection with Russia, between Ukraine and Russia. Many Ukrainians speak Russian. The Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was actually aligned with the Russian Orthodox Church until 2019, when the Ukrainian Orthodox Church declared its independence from the Russian Orthodox Church. So that added to the intrigue. And finally, there's a lot of natural resources in this area as well. Grain, oil, other natural resources. So it's important from an economic standpoint. So again, why Ukraine? So there's a historical fear of the West that goes way back. You can look at Napoleon in the 1810s. You can look at Germany during World War I, and especially during World War II, when the Soviet Union really took a beating. Over, between 30 and 40 million Soviet citizens died during World War II. So there's a historic belief that there's a need for a buffer. There is the humiliation after the Cold War, all right, from this big Russian empire. It's a lot smaller than it used to be. So there's this humiliation. Used to be a world power, not so much anymore. On top of that, the former republics, some of them, were actually still scared of Russia, so they wanted to join NATO and be part of the European Union. All right, so that was going to be a problem. And then finally, at least as far as Ukraine is concerned, in 2014, they tossed out their government that was aligned with Russia and replaced it with the current government, a more democratic government, a government that wanted to be aligned with the European Union. That was pretty much for Putin. And it led to the invasion of the Donbass region, which is up over in here, and then also down here in the Crimea, which was taken over, and it's still under control of Russia. So Ukraine learned their lesson from 2014. Their military is a lot better than it used to be, as you guys are finding out when you're reading about it. What they've been able to pull off in the last 6 weeks is really unbelievable. So going back to why Ukraine, one of the biggest things on top of all this is Putin's not interested in having a democracy as a next door neighbor. He views it as a threat. And so that's the quick and dirty overview of the history. We'll bring on Brian Dilley to talk about the political science perspective.
What about the second mic? Is there a second mic?
Yeah.
Do I need to be wearing that one too?
Are you talking loud?
All right. All right, gotta get all mic'd up here. Because one mic's not enough. I feel like I'm gonna be eating it. All right, how's that sound-wise? Okay. Oh, this, okay, this is the other one. All right, this one's for the room. Is that right? Okay, so I'm going to be building on some of the things we're talking about. Oh, here we go, there's the volume. Okay. Because all right, so to pick up on that, with the context for the current situation, we're going to be looking at why things are happening, the way that they're happening, and some of the consequences of what's happening from an international relations point of view. So this map just shows sort of where the conflict is located. Primarily red is where the Russian troops are most active. Purple is in the last week, they've withdrawn from a lot of those purple regions in the last week. So, yes? Can't, okay, is this doing anything with the room?
Turn it here, turn. Try that.
All right, did I turn myself down? I think all right. This is the speaker, though.
Yeah.
Is the speaker working there?
No.
That is so weird. All right. Okay. Can I? Oh, yes. Thank you. There we go. All right. And again, the color's washing out a little bit, so the vagaries. I can put this outside so it's not in my pocket. Okay. Why are things happening the way that they're happening? There's a few things we can talk about on why Russia felt that violence was necessary. Why did they go to war? And the context that Professor Hyder's brought up really helps explain it. So NATO expansion, EU expansion, the need for Putin to maintain control domestically, and then there's an actual military argument for why there, why now, why it makes sense. So we'll look at each of these real quick. With NATO expansion, it's already been mentioned, so we'll go through it quickly here. But this map shows the chronological expansion of NATO. So NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, was created in response to the Warsaw Pact. After World War II, the Russians destroyed the Nazis in Eastern Europe. The Western Alliance destroyed the Nazis in Western Europe. At the end of the war, the Americans and their allies were like sick to death of war, and they wanted the boys to be home by Christmas. So they demobilized the military. The Russians never demobilized their military. So the big giant army that killed the Nazis, they just set up shop and stayed put. And so that's part of what led to the Cold War. But because there was this giant army in the East, the Western powers needed to form a defensive alliance because they didn't want to set up a giant army in the West also. So they set up the NATO alliance in response to that. So that's the origin of the NATO alliance. After the Cold War ended, a lot of people were like, well, why even have NATO, right? The whole reason to stop it was to prevent the Russians. But the other thing that NATO did, in addition to making the Soviets think twice before moving into Germany, is it unified the Europeans because they're all part of the same, they're on the same team. And so that unity brought a stability to Europe. And at the end of the Cold War, that stability was very valued, particularly in Eastern Europe, with all the instability that the end of the Cold War brought. Having NATO around was like a warm security blanket that Europe just wanted to have. And so that was sort of NATO 2.0 was that. And that's the explanation for why NATO expanded, even though there was no Warsaw Pact for it to counter, is because in order to join NATO, the criteria had to be met. And those criteria were democracy, so free government, economic transparency, free trade, and your military units had to be compatible with other Western military units. So that as a French soldier is firing their automatic weapon and they run out of ammunition, they reach over and they grab the clip from the American soldier next to them, pop it into their gun, and keep shooting. The ammunition's interchangeable. Their communication systems are interchangeable. It's an integrated military. That means that instead of buying Russian toys, you're buying Western toys. So part of joining NATO was to integrate militarily and have those economic and political connections as well. So NATO expansion then is wrapped into that whole agenda to democratize and expand globalization and free trade, and also create a unified military market and structure as well. So this is why it expanded east. And the different colors show, the original NATO, and then we have immediately after the Cold War is when these purple ones join, and then the yellow are countries who would like to be part of NATO but are not currently part of NATO. All right, so that's expansion. Now in addition, there are 21 countries who are not part of NATO but are partners with NATO. And this Partnership for Peace program was started after the Cold War to again help countries transition to democracy, transition to transparent economic systems. You'll notice Ukraine and Russia are both part of the Partnership for Peace program with NATO. And so for about 10 years, it looked like Russia might be part of NATO as well. And then Putin took over, and Russia stopped that progress and started viewing NATO as a problem, not as a potential alliance friendship. All right, the Schengen area, so this is the European Union. It also is expanding, not connected to NATO, but not a dissimilar motive as well. They're trying to integrate Europe economically, and so it's expanding eastward as well as NATO. And so the Schengen area is the sort of free trade for the European Union, that if you're in the Schengen area, it's kind of like traveling from Arizona to Wyoming. You know, you can sell stuff, you don't have to pay taxes or tariffs. If you're selling stuff to Wyoming, you don't need a passport. You can just get in a car and drive to Wyoming. It's the same way European Union if you're in the Schengen area. So that's what the border of the European Union is. Also expanding. You'll notice Ukraine is also a candidate country for the European Union to join that Schengen as well. You'll notice Russia, not a yellow country, not part of that plan to do that. All right, so those are some of that helps explain some of the expansion. What about the need for domestic political control? Here's where we try to get into the head of Putin. Because one thing to understand is that Russia is not a democracy. They go through the motions, but it is called an illiberal democracy. That's where they pretend to be a democracy. They have elections, but they're not really meaningful elections because opposition parties are not really free. The media is controlled by the government. Critics of the government in Russia have this nasty habit of falling out of windows from tall big buildings. Right, they come down with mysterious poisonings. Right, it's not a good life choice to be an opposition person in Russia. So it's not really democracy. I was listening to an interview by an American diplomat who was talking about a conversation he had with Putin years ago, and Putin was sort of, lecturing him as one does when you're an autocratic president, and he said, "You Americans, you think the Russians want to be democratic." He said that the mistake that you're making is that you think because Eastern Europeans, Slavs, are white Europeans, that they want democracy. He said, they don't. The Slavs don't want democracy. He said the Slavs are not able to govern themselves. He said they need a strong government. They need protection, and because only a strong government can protect them and help them prosper. And that is their natural inclination. And so the Slavic people don't want democracy. You should stop asking them to. And so that's sort of Putin's worldview, is that those people shouldn't be democracies because it's bad for them. Remember the argument that was made after the Cold War, what would you say, democracy just brought trouble? Yeah, and instability. And so this map here is where the Slavic people are located. And so from Putin's worldview, none of these people are good candidates for democracy. They're all sort of naturally part of the Russian sphere of influence and the Russian culture. They ought to be part of the Russian culture from his point of view. So once you understand that, you can see that a functioning democracy in a Slavic country is not necessarily a geopolitical threat, but it is a direct threat to Putin's domestic control, because the argument he's giving his own people is, my authoritarian government is good for you. Democracy is bad for you because you're a Slav. And then they look at someplace like Poland or the Ukraine, and they're like, well, democracy's working good over there, right? Why can't we have democracy, right? It destabilizes his whole pitch that he's making to his own people. So he cannot abide a viable, functioning democracy in Ukraine. It's a direct threat to his domestic ideology. Right. Then there are genuine military needs. There are Russian troops in Crimea, as was seized in 2014. And there's Russian troops working in the Donbas regions. But there's also Russian troops in Moldova. Because after the Cold War, there were all sorts of separatist groups around. And I can't even pronounce this, the Transnistria, however you say that. I don't speak Slavic countries. That region of Moldova, which is just sort of this mountainous region on the border between the Ukraine and Moldova, has a separatist group that fought against the government of Moldova, and the Russians sided with the separatist group and has Russian peacekeepers stationed in the Transnistria region of Moldova. And so part of the military objective here is to create a land bridge between Russia and the Dnipro region of Moldova. And if they were to do that, it would make it so that they could more easily secure the eastern regions that they're helping in Ukraine and get to Crimea without having to go through the Bosporus, not the Bosporus, the Dardanelles Straits. Anyway, the only way to get from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea is going through territory that Turkey controls. And by the way, 3 weeks ago, Turkey said, sorry, Russia, and just closed the gates. So Russia can't move any ships through that region. That's a really bad place to be as a sovereign country if you can't equip your troops using boats. So you have to go overland. They can't do that because there's this country called Ukraine in the way. And so if they were to take the southern region of Ukraine, you might have heard of Mariupol. That's a major military objective for them. And then the Melitopol, and then they've attacked Odessa, but they have not really attacked it with land troops. They've attacked it with naval troops and bombardments and missiles and things. But you can anticipate that if things were going the way Russia would have liked them to have gone, they probably would have moved land troops into there by now. But they haven't because things aren't going their way. But the objective is if they're able to do that, then they have a land bridge all the way to Moldova so they can equip their own troops, and they control the entire coastline, which turns the Ukraine into a landlocked country. And if you know anything about political geography, landlocked countries are weak, poor places because they don't have access to global markets, because they're landlocked, and it would turn Ukraine into an economic albatross for the West. They would be constantly having to have continuous foreign aid to keep it even going if they were to lose access to the ocean. So those are sort of the military objectives of why they're fighting, where they're fighting. Okay, so that's sort of the context. Let's look at their strategy real quick. Plan A for was modeled on the Georgian War. So back in 2008, 4, 6, this is why I don't teach history. Back in the Bush administration, that's how I think of things, mid-2000s, very similar situation. Eastern provinces of Georgia were separatist, allied with Russia. Georgia was wanting to ally with the West economically, military. They started talking out loud about joining NATO. The Bush administration's like, hey, that sounds like a great idea. And Russia's like, I don't think so. And so Russia invades. Actually, Georgia technically started it by attacking the separatist area in South Ossetia. And so Russia sends their troops in to help out the Ossetians and completely annihilates the Georgian army. And they destroyed it very quickly, and they threatened the capital of Tbilisi and assassinated some of the leaders. And Georgia very quickly realized this was a really bad idea to make Russia angry, and they sued for peace right away. And Russia got very favorable peace terms, which is that Russian troops are permanently based in those separatist movements, which makes it impossible for Georgia to become a NATO ally. And it was sort of an object lesson on don't get too close to the West because they ain't coming to help, because we didn't. And so I believe this is what Putin had in mind with the Ukrainian war, the initial Ukrainian war. Because what did he do? He flooded troops into the separatist regions, and then he attacked Kiev, which doesn't make sense militarily unless you realize he's trying to do to Ukraine what he did to Georgia, which is to deliver a very quick knockout blow, make it very painful for the leadership, eliminate some leadership if you can get away with it, and they will quickly sue for peace. That peace will be then on favorable terms, meaning Russian troops in the eastern regions, Crimea permanently annexed, and then maybe neutrality. Another object lesson to not go join NATO. Didn't work. So now we're in Plan B, which is the way Russia normally fights protracted wars in the modern era. The model is not Georgia, the model is Chechnya and Syria. What did the Georgian military do in those cases where they were not able to have a quick victory? They engaged in a war of attrition, and they annihilated civilians, as many as possible, to make life completely untenable so that resistance would be crushed. That's what they did in Chechnya, and that's what they backed Syria, and then once they directly intervened in the Syrian war, did it Syria. So if you look at the rebel-held territories in Syria, they held out for a long time until the Russians directly entered the war, and then they just annihilated them, turned their cities to rubble. That's the way Russia fights. And that's their plan B. And that's what's happening now, is they're targeting apartment complexes, parks, train stations, right? They are intentionally targeting civilian targets in order to annihilate and destroy the area, because that's what worked for them in the past. They just picked a new general, and what was that general's specialty? This is what that general does, and that's why he got picked. So this is going to be their plan B. All right, real quickly, that's the context. Those are their strategies. Let's look at the geopolitical consequences of the Ukrainian war. Russia has three main objectives here: to annex Ukraine, or at least replace their leadership, to push back NATO, and then use Ukraine as an object lesson to Finland and Sweden, saying, don't even talk about NATO. All three of these objectives were not met in the first week of the war. The opposites happened with all these. Instead, Europe was united, NATO was revitalized. Finland and Sweden, who weren't talking about joining NATO, now are. And this is an important point to make. Nobody was seriously talking about Ukraine joining NATO prior to this invasion. Ukraine said several times out loud, gee, it'd be nice. And the Biden administration is like, yeah, we'll talk about that. But there was no actual movement. The appetite for NATO expansion is very small prior to this invasion, because it's costly and you don't want to make the Russians mad. We were being very careful about it until this invasion. Now NATO's like, ooh, this is why we have NATO. Because if you're not part of NATO, Russia will kill you. If you are part of NATO, they'll think twice. And so now a lot of countries are like, maybe NATO, not a bad idea. So Finland and Sweden, who've not joined NATO for 70 years, are like, I think we might want to do that now. And NATO has a reason to exist now. So now they're talking about NATO 3.0 moving forward. The Americans, Republicans and Democrats, have been whining and complaining to the Germans for decades about how they're not spending enough for their own defense. Because the American security umbrella that they enjoy gets paid for by US taxpayers, and they've been enjoying it, kind of a free ride. And I don't want to join the NATO bashers, because NATO, most people don't know that more NATO troops died in Afghanistan than American troops. Right? NATO was there when we asked them to be there. They made the sacrifices when we asked them to make the sacrifices. But when you're just looking at raw money, they're not spending nearly as much as they could be spending. That's just changed. Germany said, all right, we're going to double their defense budget. Huge increases in Germany. That's going to have long-term implications. And then, Ukraine's now more anti-Russian than they ever were before. All right, so that's the impact in Europe. What's the impact globally, geopolitically? It's not good. I was listening to a thing that was saying basically that The impact on the world is going to be very negative no matter what happens. And that's because Russia, huge energy exporter and a very significant food importer, and one of the global leaders on fertilizer, all that's done. And so that means the rest of the world who relies on Russian imports of food, fertilizer, and fuel are now going to be in trouble. Ukraine, also major food exporter. I was talking with a friend of mine in Yemen, and in Yemen, they get almost all of their food. Like their lead food importer is Russia, and their number 2 food importer is Ukraine. And so their top 2 food importers are now out of the market, and they're already starving in Yemen. And so you can imagine how bad things are going to be 6 months from now, a year from now. And that's going to play out around the world as food and fuel prices increase dramatically. Because even if you've got enough food in your country, the fact that these 6 countries around you don't have food, meaning they're going to be buying food, and that it's a global commodity. And so the price of that food is going to go up, even if you've got plenty. So even in the United States, we will see increases in food prices. So imagine if you're a poor country and the price of food is going dramatically up. And so there's kind of I've got the causal arrow here. So we've got wars disrupting food and fuel markets. That will lead to an increased price in basic goods, which will lead to an increase in poverty and hunger around the world, which will lead to increased instability in marginal societies. And we're already seeing that. This is a picture of protests in Peru that happened last week and are still happening now. What caused those protests? The government increased the price of fuel, and the society went crazy because they're already on the edge. And so around the world, we're going to be seeing revolts, insurrections, massive protests as people are increasingly poor and hungry, and they're blaming their government for it. And so that's going to destabilize a lot of countries around the world. It's got nothing to do with Russia and Ukraine, but that's what's going to happen globally. The other global consequence is if Russia wins, it'll destabilize the global order because it proves that conquest works, which we've been trying to convince people not to do it that way. The return of conquest is legitimate. Fracturing of Europe, because Europe's going to have to pick sides if Russia wins, and they're going to have to cozy up to Russia or cozy up to the Americans. Can't do both anymore. And then China will be emboldened because they'll say, hey, awesome, Russia got away with it. If Russia loses, European Union will possibly emerge as a global power because the European Union is going to be more cohesive politically, possibly militarily. They haven't really taken that step before. They might now, particularly because under the Trump administration, as the United States withdrew, one thing that the Germans, Angela Merkel, she said, we can no longer count on the United States because of the U.S. withdrawing from Europe during the Trump administration. And so Europe may look at the United States as an unreliable partner now and might start doing its own independent military stuff. The U.S. could return to its status as the leader of the free world. That's a very Cold War coat that we're comfortable wearing. We might return to that. The Russian military has been completely discredited, which means no one's going to buy their stuff anymore. And then a reduced fear of China, because if Russia, with all of its advantages, can't take on Ukraine, which shares a 1,000-mile border that you can just walk over, right? China's going to think twice about threatening Taiwan, which is across a body of water that it can't get to without making the Americans upset. So either way, there's going to be some fairly significant geopolitical shifts, whoever wins this war. So a lot of scholars are saying that the last month has had 100 years of change in the global geopolitical system, and that is what they're talking about. All right, I need to stop talking so that we can talk about sanctions now.
Thank you, Brian.
Yes.
Let me just
I'll hook you up. If you do this, I'll hook you up to there.
It's simple.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Hold on. This is mine. That goes here.
That's for the room.
And this one.
And this one's for the audience.
Okay.
I'm just going to pull
All
this.
right. Plug it in. And all right. Great. Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me well? Yay. All right. So my topic is not as exciting as their topic, right? And I'm going to ask Jules to read this quote. I think it's important quote. How many of you knows about Adam Smith? Raise your hand. All right, there are quite a few people. Okay. Well, I will ask Jules to read this quote quickly for us.
The state or sovereignty is by nature most strongly recommended to us. Not only we ourselves, but all the objects of our kindest affections, our children, our parents, our relations, our friends, our benefactors, all those whom we naturally love and revere the most, are commonly comprehended within it, and their prosperity and safety depend in some measure upon its prosperity and safety.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Adam Smith wrote the book, The Theory of the Moral Sentiment. In this book, he's writing about lack of empathy or sympathy we have for the other countries, especially those which are far, far away behind our borders. I would like to take a moment and acknowledge today your presence, and I would like to take a moment and acknowledge the country we are living in currently, how lucky we are that we can share our research, our thoughts, and not to be punished and put to the jail like people in Russia for 20 years. So let me start with the sanction. On February 22nd, President Joe Biden announced sanctions against Russia in response to Russian military aggression against Ukraine. Some of you may know what are the sanctions, some of you may not. So let me just quickly define that. Sanctions are penalties where one country imposes against the other country, organization, or individuals. They can have a different forms, and we have functions different countries for different reasons. Perhaps we can cut it off some financial assistance. They can also have a form of embargoes. They can have a form of tariffs. Or we can freeze some assets, as we have it done in this case. President Wilson he mentioned that sanctions are a great diplomatic tool. And they are a great diplomatic tool and less costly than war is. In this case, they could be perhaps one weapon we have against Russia. So there are several sanctions that has been imposed, and many of you have heard probably in the media. I allowed myself to classify them in the very broad three categories. The first one is financial, the second one is import and export, and the third one is sanctions on individuals. We won't have a time, because Brian took all this time, to discuss the third one. But Paul described very well oligarchs, and I will be willing to stay after the presentations and discuss with you the third sanction if you're interested in learning a little bit more about oligarchs. So let's start with the financial, as this is really the harshest one sanction imposed against Russia. So Russian banks has been removed from the SWIFT system. Some of you may wonder, what is a SWIFT system? SWIFT system is really, really secure networks, has a great history, where the banks are communicating, they sending through each other messages to execute some financial transactions. This system has been used for quite some time, and currently has over 11,000 of members, and it's used in 209 countries. And everyday transaction, they complete about 37 million everyday transactions around the world. So that all sounds good in the theory. Now, here's what I gotta admit to it. President Putin very well prepared himself for this war, right? He was thought about it. He was thinking about it for quite some time. He developed his own financial system, and the system called CIPS, Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, which he's currently using to purchase and to pay his obligations with China, okay, and India. The SWIFT system, on the other hand, is used through the main credit card companies such as MasterCard, Visa, American Express, and is also used by PayPal. So, Russia's transactions, Russia's domestic payments are going to be right now very disrupted since they are unable to use the SWIFT system and since they are unable to pay through the credit cards. So as you can imagine, there is kind of a domino effect. If you're unable to use credit cards, a lot of retailers pulling out of the Russian market. You can see some luxurious one like a Little Caesars or Gucci or Louis Vuitton, Chanel and others. You can see some of them. So what they're doing right now, they're pulling out of the Russian market, okay? They're freezing their business in Russia right now. So their employees are going home, they're receiving paychecks, by the way, so they are paid now during the war period. However, so this situation perhaps right now it's not going to have a negative impact on the Russian economy. However, it may have it in a few months once those companies completely pull out their investment, as tobacco, British companies, tobaccos did. Others, airlines company, they just stopped their operations completely. So that could be an option. And in this case, we'll have a tremendous impact on the Russian economy because we will lose a lot on consumption, on investment, and we will also have less tax revenues coming from this type of companies, right, from the contribution. So there is something what I gotta share with you. Again, President Putin really thought about this war very well. He built up himself really good cushions of money. So currently, Russia has a surplus. They have 630 billion of money sitting. They are ready. They were ready for this war. We got to remember that there is a lot of prediction, what if, right? So that's the hard part, especially in economics. What if? So let's move towards Central Bank of Russia. Central Bank of Russia, there has been some sanction imposed on them too, meaning they are unable to sell and buy currencies outside of Russian rubles. So they can go buy in euros particularly or dollars particularly. What that means that during the time of invasion, as you can see, the Russian rubles dramatically dropped. The value of it dropped for about 1/3. What was the impact on Russian market? People started panicking. They were going to the ATMs, pulling up the money. Russian government realized that is going to be a lot of panic in the Russian society. What are we going to do? We're going to put it on cap on each individual. So Paul is unable right now to pull it out more than 1,000 rubles a day. Very creative. What happened then is Russia is unable to continue many transactions in rubles. So what they're going to do, President Putin is coming and saying again, since I'm selling you my oil and my gas and 45% countries in Europe is buying oil and gas, you guys, unfriendly countries, are going to pay me the money in rubles, your obligation in rubles. So we're going to stimulate the demand for the Russian rubles. So the Russian ruble's value is going up. Also, when we impose the SWIFT sanction on Russia, remember, we have only imposed the SWIFT sanction on the main 7 banks in Russia, not all of them. Okay, so there's still some transactions, smaller transactions coming and going. So Russia is still able to buy some resources and sell some resources, maybe not as much as they used to, but they're still able. So that's kind of increased the demand for Russian rubles, as well as a lot of transactions in China. President Putin asked China to continue their payments, not in the Chinese yuan, but in rubles. Let me see quickly how much time I have. Okay. Those sanctions, they had tremendous impact on the gas and oil. And that's why you're here, right? You're probably one of those people who is saying, are we going to pay more for oil? Sure, a great question. So let me start with the gas and then I will proceed with the oil. Russia is exporting 40 to 45% of natural gas to Europe. You can see those pipelines coming out of the Russia. A lot of natural gas goes to China, goes to Turkey, goes to Belarus, and Russia is one of the biggest exporters of natural gas. And it's really difficult because a country like Germany, they rely very much so on natural gas of Russia. So 95% of German natural gas comes from Russia. 95%, that's a big number. They're really relying. They're using this gas not to only heat up the citizen homes, but to produce goods and services. For pharmaceutical industry, that's what they are specializing in. For what other industry? Let me think quickly. Fertilization process, right? For chemical industry, they're using this gas constantly. So just imagine if Putin will shut off this gas. That will be a traumatic impact on Russian economy. There's a lot of discussions in Europe right now on using a biogas. So let's talk quickly about the gas. There is no magic behind that. It's demand and supply, supply and demand. One thing what the students remember when they leave the college. Russia is major exporter of oil, of crude oil to Europe. And Europe and Asia are the largest receivers, importers of it. So Russia exports about 5 million of barrels per day to Germany, to Hungary, to Netherlands, South Korea, and China. And also to India. Now there is a problem with that because now once we impose the SWIFT systems, as you can imagine, Russia is not anymore exporting 5 million of barrels per day. Do you know how much right now they are able to export? 1 million. That's all. In fact, a lot of European countries, they don't want to buy Russian oil. The main gas station in England, in Europe, Shell gas station, they don't want to buy Russian oil. They don't want to support this industry. And now with the SWIFT sanctions, they don't want to deal with that. It's a lot of hassle for them. So the demand for Russian oils dramatically decreased. So their barrel costs about $80 a barrel compared to the other oil, 103 per barrel, right? As you know, oil is sent just like energy. Oil is sent on a global market commodity, right? So once the invasion started, the prices spikes up, and unfortunately, we as America, we pay price for it as well. There was just, at some point, not enough oil. oil is very interesting commodity as well, because once oil prices increases, every stage of production increases, right? And we got to be careful with that, because higher oil prices can really drag the inflation higher. So as you probably know, United States is going to release 1 million barrels per day to increase the supply of oil and lower the prices. I think that's all what I have. I would like to just summarize that, we are really walking very thin line with Russia right now. We want to punish them through the sanction, because that's what the sanctions are for, but we do not want to create a global crisis, because we're still recovering from COVID. Our economy is recovering too. So with that, thank you everybody, and I will pass to Paul.
So we can take some time for questions. And I do want to remind you that, here we go.
Sorry.
That's okay. No, you can do that. If you want to know more about these topics,
Here,
thank
this
you.
one.
We'll pass this around. This is yours, right?
No, this one. There you go, sorry. It's just too much stuff.
Okay, good. All right, just want to remind you that if you want to know more about these topics, that we teach whole classes about these things. And so, as you say, if you want to know more about geopolitics, take world politics, diplomacy, negotiations, how we make decisions here in America, looking at modern European history and how sanctions affect the global economy. All of these things you can learn more about if you take classes from us in the fall semester. So we hope you will like to do that, because we'd love to see you in our classes and talk more about these things in more detail. Then each of us had a lot more than 10 minutes of content. See, I couldn't even keep myself to 10. So, questions from the crowd? Yes.
All of this, as it's happening, it seems to be moving with money. I'm curious about President Putin and the oligarchs, how the money is being funded. Are the oligarchs giving him money? Are they supporting the war machine? So that was kind of just my first question, is how President Putin, the oligarchs, and money is all being circulated.
Okay, would you like to?
Please restate the question.
Okay, the question was, what is the relationship between the oligarchs and Putin, particularly when it comes to money? As far as, is he giving them money? Are they giving him money? And then also with the impact of the sanctions on the oligarchs? Can I just expand that in? All right, so I can handle the first part of that, and I'm going to have you do the second half. So the oligarchs are friends of Putin. When Putin came to power, the oligarchs were already wealthy. One thing that to remember is that when the Cold War ended, they were a communist system that had to turn into a capitalist system. And so the way they did that was they just handed out shares of all the state enterprises to their workers. And that way it was overnight turned into capitalism. But there was no money in the country. There was no hard currency. And so if you're a worker, you haven't been paid in 8 months, because there's a reason the Soviet Union collapsed. So you haven't been paid in like 8 months, and now they hand you a piece of paper saying, congratulations, you have part ownership in the factory, and you've got like 10 shares. Well, you can't eat shares. And so you have to turn that into cash somehow. And so throughout Russia, the people who were given those shares sold those shares to the people who did have money in Russia. Who had money in Russia during the Cold War? The mafia, for the most part. And so this is how the mafia took over the rest of Russia legitimately, because they bought it fair and square as part of the transition to capitalization, the shock treatment that was talked about. And so when Putin came to power, you had these super massively wealthy people who owned most of the country. And Putin reined them in by making some object lessons of a few of them, basically nationalizing their company, throwing them into jail, and basically made it clear that you can stay wealthy if you support me. If you don't support me, I will destroy you. And so he's not giving them money, they're not giving him money, but there is a direct patron-client relationship politically with them. Okay, let's go to the effect of sanctions on them.
So as far as the sanction goes, there was a last package of sanction implemented at the beginning of this month, the 5th one. And what that does is prevents oligarchs from using their assets. So they don't have a simple yachts, they have a super yachts, you know. It's kind of nice, yeah, lifestyle. They have a properties, you know, next to the Buckingham Palace, right? So they hold a lot of wealth. They hold 30% of Russia's total wealth. Those are people who own steel industry, oil industry, aluminum industry in Russia. So they hold a lot of wealth themselves. As far as the money goes, sharing the money, who serve whom, it's very not clear to me. I would love to research that, but I can't give you any more answer right now on that.
No, I appreciate
Good
it.
enough?
Yes,
Okay, we passed the test. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, it's all yours, Paul.
We've got 2 questions.
Oh, we have a question on the back. Okay.
Go ahead.
So, regarding Vladimir Putin as the leader, it doesn't really seem like he cares about like the will of his people. So, is there really anything that can be done to actually challenge his authority or punish him in any way?
Okay, so the question revolves around Putin and him caring or not caring about the will of his people. And the follow-up to that is there anything that can be done internally, I'm guessing, to change the leadership? Is that where you're going with that?
I'm saying more like, is there anything that like NATO can do to specifically punish him, like outside of just straight up going to war with Putin?
Right, okay.
Something like similar to sanctions, I guess. He doesn't care about sanctions, so that's why not.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So first off, historically, Russian leaders have not cared about their population. I mean, you look at the way the war is being fought with the soldiers that they have. Most of those guys didn't even know they were going to war until they showed up. And then if you look at World War II and the Soviet Union and the number of folks that died in that, it's just part of that was the Russian way of war. So the first thing is there's not a real good history of caring about your average Russian citizen from leadership. The other part of that is the state media is really, really good. A lot of Russians are in favor of the war because they're getting a different message than what we're getting. And so there's a lot of Russians that are gung-ho, and it's splitting up families. I mean, there'll be Russian families that have people living in Ukraine and living in Russia, and they're arguing about what the facts are. So that's part of the problem. Is there anything more that can be done as far as affecting Putin? I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. At what point, the thing that gets kind of scary about this whole thing is in the past, in the Cold War, when there was a conflict, there was usually a situation where sides could save face. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a good example of that, where the Soviet Union was able to save face. And then looking at what's going on right now, to me, it's just like it's watching a movie and wondering how it's going to end. And also wondering how it's going to end well. Because at this stage, I don't know how Putin saves face. Does that help you out there? Yeah. Okay.
And politically, the short answer is no.
Tagging on to your answer, what do you see as the most likely scenarios for resolution of both the military conflict in the Ukraine and the geopolitical issues that you just described, and what things could affect that? Russia can use nuclear weapons if they want to. They have it. They have a larger air force than Ukraine. They could overpower them if they wanted to, but they haven't. How do you see this most likely playing out?
Like I said, this is like a movie. I don't know how it's going to end. I'm going to let Brian try to tackle that question.
Please summarize the question.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Sure. The question was, what is the outcome that we can expect, given that Russia's military is demonstrably larger, has lots of assets he hasn't brought to bear yet? What can we expect to happen? The answer is my crystal ball broke a long time ago. And I'm the wrong person to ask, because I predicted that there would not be a war, because there's no possible scenario where the benefits of attacking Ukraine will outweigh the long-term costs of outweighing Ukraine. So it's an irrational move to begin with. So it's very hard to predict what he'll do now. And yes, Russia has a lot more assets to bring to bear. However, can he, without risking further conflict with NATO? You know, you bring in missiles. It's hard. You know, what happens if one of those missiles strays into Poland? Well, now all of a sudden you're fighting directly the West. And so there are constraints on what Putin can do. And also the story he's telling his own people is that Ukraine is run by a bunch of murderous thugs who are Nazis, and they're liberating the people from this corrupt, horrible government. As soon as you start leveling all of the cities and using air bombardment, that narrative breaks down, because you're killing the people you're supposed to be liberating. So there are some self-imposed limits on what he can do. And also, okay, you got some dead? Okay. Anyway, it's anybody's guess. Find a better crystal ball. Mine doesn't work.
So yeah, Brian brought up the whole notion of Nazis, and that's the rhetoric that Putin's using. He's equating Ukrainians with Nazis, and for a good reason, because most Russians are brought up on the Great Patriotic War, World War II, and so there's a lot of pride in defeating Germany. And so if you can equate the enemy nowadays as the same enemy that you defeated during the Patriotic War, you're going to have a lot of support from your population. And so the other part of that too is the war is going to get worse in terms of destruction, because if you look at the rhetoric that's coming out of Moscow right now, it's gone. It started out as we're going to reunite Russian-speaking people, and now it's turning into we are going to murder all those Nazis, and that gets to be scary stuff.
Okay, this gentleman here had a question.
Yeah, I must start by commending first the faculty for this initiative, which is very insightful and informative. So in international relations, two terms are usually used. Would you care to at least show a little light on it from a political perspective? The term America's backyard and the term near abroad.
Sure. Repeat the question. Okay, so the question was, talk about the situation using the international relations terms of the near abroad and America's backyard. So both of those terms refer to spheres of influence that are recognized that great powers have. For the United States, we call it the America's backyard, which is don't mess with stuff in our backyard. And we often use it to refer to Latin America. It's a very imperialist / racist approach, but it's something that sort of runs through American history with our foreign policy in particular, is that there's an expectation that America should have a greater voice in what happens in its immediate neighborhood. That same notion other countries apply to as well. So France thinks of West Africa as their sort of special playground. The Chinese are trying to do that with the South China Sea, right? It's their neighborhood. And so in Russia, the term they use is the near abroad. And so if we were to pull up the history slide, if we could get that back up here, where it was this one. Can you make that bigger? Okay, so the Soviet Union had this huge buffer here of Eastern Europe. And at the end of the Cold War, they lost that buffer as they all became independent countries. But the Russians still think of this territory as the near abroad, meaning the countries that are right next to them. And they feel that they have a right to have a greater influence on those countries than the Americans or the Chinese or anybody else, because it's their sphere of influence as they see it. Now, the people who live in that near abroad, the Polish, the Ukrainians, the Estonians, they don't think of themselves as part of Russia's natural sphere of influence, but Russia certainly thinks of them as part of their natural sphere of influence. So it's an excellent concept to understand why Putin specifically and Russia generally was so worried about NATO expansion, because it bumps into what they see as their near abroad special place. The same way we think when Russia comes to Cuba or Nicaragua, we're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Right? Don't play in our yard. Yeah, Phil?
Question. How do you think the fact that President Biden called Putin actually what's going on a genocide, how do you think that will affect how the Eastern, the EU's views this whole thing, or maybe some of the other countries that have stayed silent up to now?
Thanks, and I'll take that as well, because that's an international law thing. So by using the term genocide, it's a word that you have to be careful when you're using, because after World War II, one of the very first things the brand new United Nations did was sign a convention against genocide and said, hey, that whole Holocaust thing, bad idea, let's not do that again. So the whole world signed on to this document saying, we will not allow genocide to happen. And if that convention is triggered, basically every country who signed that treaty, which is basically everybody, says if genocide is proven, we, the rest of the world, have an obligation to intervene and eliminate that regime and prevent it and stop it. And so this is why the word genocide is hardly ever used, because if it's accepted, it implies a treaty obligation to go in and stop it and prevent it. And most countries don't want to deal with that, and so they'll use euphemisms like crimes against humanity or ethnic cleansing or all those things from the 90s, because they didn't want to use the word genocide. So it is significant that he used that word. The second half of the question is, what are going to be the consequences? And the answer are none, because Russia has nuclear weapons. And so we're not going to invoke the Convention on Genocide, because to do so would require us to invade Russia and change the government, because that's what the convention calls for. And you can't do that to a country with nuclear weapons. So it's political, it's rhetoric. It's a dangerous thing, because, again, that word has hardly ever been used because it's supposed to have these major consequences. So you don't want to cheapen the word genocide. So that's kind of the pro and con against Biden using that word. It really ramps up the pressure, but it also, you can only use that word so many times without making it meaningless. Yes?
Historically, like with this kind of thing, do you think that he's going to stop with Ukraine, or do you think he's going to continue into other countries, specifically Turkey, because they have that thing going on there?
So I'll do the politics, and then, because thankfully you said historically, I'm going to hand it over. But he will not go into other NATO countries because it's a NATO country, and it'd be World War III. But he might go into places that are not part of NATO, and he may want to, which I'll lead to the historical.
So this question revolved around is he going to invade something else next? So I would say that my guess would be no, just because he's got his hands full where he's at. I'd say the Baltic countries are the ones, even though they're NATO countries, they're the ones that are sweating it the most. Lithuania, for example, is very worried. But my guess is that he wouldn't, just because Ukraine has turned out so poorly. But who knows? I mean, who knows?
The shelf may be empty pretty quick.
Well, and that's the other thing. I mean, there's only so many resources that he has access to in terms of men and the hardware, the military hardware. So.
Tell me if I'm wrong. As far as I can tell, Ukrainians are going to win this war. As far far as I can tell, the United States has already given the Ukrainian army enough stuff to blow up all their tanks. And that ship just sunk the other day, so I got a fun feeling the Ukrainians are beginning to give missiles to take out their ships. And the next step is to bring in heavier equipment to take out their air force. So as far as I can tell, this is going to go into the Ukrainians' favor. It may take a couple of years, but that's my thinking. Can you tell me where I'm wrong?
Okay. No, so we have a prediction here that Ukraine is going to win because they have been so successful so far, and they keep on getting more hardware from the Western nations, and that at some point Russia's just not going to be able to keep it up anymore, and that after two or
I think all their tanks are
Yeah.
gone. They want to fight it out on the east side of Ukraine. As far as I can tell.
Okay. So anyway, so there is the prediction. I don't know if you're right or not. I mean, I think the wild card is always going to be nuclear weapons.
Yeah, if they go nuclear or chemical.
Yeah, then that changes the whole ball game.
I will add one thing, which is that the weapons that we've been giving them are primarily defensive weapons. They're very effective at blowing stuff up coming at you. We have not given them weapons that are offensive weapons. We've not given them artillery, aircraft, things like that. And so, because again, the danger is if you give Ukraine a bunch of offensive weapons, and Ukraine, who's now justifiably a little annoyed at Russia, they might use those offensive weapons and not stop at the line.
Well, they already went overboard and took
Exactly. They already took that oil depot. And so that's the question is, do you really want them to be using NATO equipment to attacking stuff inside of Russia proper? And so I'm not sure we'll give them very much offensive weapons because of the fear. And without those weapons, they may not be able to retake eastern Ukrainian territory. So again, who knows what will happen? But it could be a long-term slugfest because neither side can succeed. All right, let's come back over here, and then I don't know, do we want to stay here as long as people want to ask questions, or do we want to call it a close? But go ahead.
So stay till 1:30 for those who want to stay. If you guys want to take off, go ahead, but we'll stay till 1:30.
I remember you mentioning President Putin is taking the money and transferring it into rubles in order to bolster his economy. So I was wondering, is all the money that's going into Russia being transferred over to rubles?
So let me just repeat the question. So you wonder if the money which are coming to Russia are converted into the ruble currency? Yeah. So with the SWIFT right now, what SWIFT does, it prevents different currency to come in to Russia. So there is no currency right now, very little currency is coming to Russia. What the Putin does, he tries to increase demand for rubles to increase the value of ruble on the currency market. And he does that by asking China to pay their obligation in rubles. And he also asks a lot of other countries like India to buy their goods and services or commodities and pay their obligation in rubles as well. Make sense? Yeah. Did I clarify that? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Lori, do we have pizza left?
Okay.
So take pizza on your way out.
Yes, take pizza. Well, and thank you everybody for joining us today. What a privilege to have you. Oh, there is one more question. Okay.
Sorry. So I've heard, and I wish I could remember where, they were talking about the UN Security Council and Russia's role on that. Whether or not they should be, can you address some of those?
Sure. So the Security Council has 15 members. 5 of them are permanent. The other 10 are rotating. Russia is one of the permanent members. The permanent members have a veto on anything the Security Council does. There's lots of arguments for why that's a bad idea. The arguments why it's a good idea is it prevents World War III, because if you don't have a veto, then you can have a situation where the United Nations ends up on one side and a great power ends up on the other side, and then you end up with a huge giant war. So by giving them the veto, it prevents the United Nations from doing anything that a major country would resist. So that's why there's the vetoes there. So Russia has a veto, which means Russia can just say no to any UN action, which means the UN is powerless to do anything when Russia's the one doing the invading. And so some people are saying, well, let's just kick Russia out. Right? Well, you can't do that without destroying the United Nations. You'd have to replace it with a different institution that's not the UN. The only way to change the charter, any charter changes that would take away the veto, has to be approved by the Security Council. And so the people who are saying, let's just kick Russia out, understandable the frustration, but again, the United Nations' primary objective is to prevent World War III. It has successfully done that for 75 years. The question is, because we're annoyed at Russia, do we destroy that and then end up with something that doesn't stop World War III? So that's the concern.
Russia missed a Security Council meeting, or was during the Korean War?
Yeah, and Russia never made that mistake again, to have a vote when they're not in the room. Yes?
You said that we were regulating the ammunition that we send to Ukraine. If Ukraine, like, are we gonna let them, is NATO gonna let Russia take it, essentially, forever? Like, if they take it, is it theirs? Or are we gonna fight back?
Well, the question was, if Russia succeeds, does NATO just accept that as a status quo? And that's another one where the crystal ball comes in, because you can see two scenarios. One is the West never accepts it, and it becomes a sort of long-term, low-level conflict, kind of like in Afghanistan, where we feed weapons in for decades to make life as miserable as possible for the whatever pro-Russian government is set up there. The other scenario is, because the war is horrible, we finally just decide, okay, enough's enough, we'll accept Russian victory in exchange for peace. And that's as plausible an outcome as us not accepting it. So I don't know, but you could see either one of those scenarios happening. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Again, get pizza on your way out, and take more classes in the fall.